sourcing and processing critical minerals, Committee on Industry and Technology.
Policy process who may have a conflict of interest because they are the recipients of benefits from a foreign regime. I'd really like to see us follow through with a Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act like Australia, or a Foreign Agents Registry Act, just so that people who are in this conflict of interest will have to declare it, and that could clear up some, mysterious decisions by government that seem to favor the Chinese regime, which I believe act against the overall interests of Canada and the international rules-based order.
Okay, thank you. And I guess to add on to that, under the Investment Canada Act, should takeovers of Canadian companies by foreign state-owned enterprises be subject to more stringent review than what is currently undertaken?
Absolutely. And as I said in my presentation, I think that when you look at Chinese enterprises, they're all under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. They all have Chinese Communist Party branches at the top of their, hierarchical structure, and it's the party secretary who coordinates their activities at the direction of Beijing, if Beijing wants to see that. And so I think that we should be going down to zero in terms of assessing the value of these investments if it does involve anything out of China or other state.
Okay, and based on the regime's previous actions, is there potential that Canada could be shut off from some of these critical mineral supply chains, in your views?
I think it's almost certainly that China would do that if they wanted to get something from Canada, such as more access to our high tech or greater capacity for the Chinese state to invest in Canadian mining and other critical infrastructure.
And where in the strategic mineral supply chain do you see Canada as being the weakest right now?
Well, that's not really a question that I have the expertise to answer. I think there are a lot of people here who have more, but obviously we should be pulling the stuff out of the ground ourselves and processing it here. Experts may have a better take on that than me, but that just strikes me as a no-brainer in terms of maintaining the integrity of our ability to avoid being subject to coercion by autocratic states who might have these things that we need for our development and would be prepared to, as they did with Japan in 2010, as I say, withdraw them to coerce us to give concessions in other areas.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Madame Gray, this is all the time we have. We'll move now to Madame Lapointe for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
For the members here from PDAC. And I'd like to ask you about domestic supply chains. So is Canada ready to not only mine the critical minerals and metals needed to shift to a zero emissions economy, but to also develop the raw materials into the products needed for electric vehicle batteries and other products? And I'm looking at this from an A to Z perspective, from mine to production to infrastructure and technology along that domestic supply chain. Where are we at in Canada on that front?
Well, if I may, I would start by suggesting that the Canadian mining and mineral exploration industry is almost unparalleled in terms of its quality, its capabilities, and the best practices that this industry brings both to its practices in Canada and abroad. So when we think about what is Canada's capability to discover more metals within our minerals and metals within our own borders and bring those metals to market, I think it's almost unequaled compared to any other country. Our ecosystem is very robust from the exploration end of things all the way through to mineral processing. Now, when we think of where are the shortfalls in our mind at PDAC, certainly we think of our members largely being the junior exploration and developers within Canada, and we think about what can be pulled out of the ground, as you pointed to. So I think our recommendations are centered around this concept that we need to build up a larger inventory of known resources and reserves within Canada. It would be in our best interest to be able to understand where those are located for quality infrastructure decisions to be able to be made so that we can understand what our energy balance will be in the future and ensure that we can actually access those prospective lands with social license to operate well in mind. So that's really where our mind is focused at this point, is just to build up that resource capacity within Canada. And with that in mind, the lion's share of what we've seen over many years with respect to exploration in Canada has been focused on precious metals, it's been focused on more traditional base metals, and the amount of attention spent on as this committee has considered before, lithium or different types of lithium species or graphite or cobalt or other metals, it's been relatively immaterial in Canada for the last foreseeable history or history in our past. So I think what I can say is we are the second largest country in terms of geography on Earth. We have every geological terrain and potential for discovery in virtually every region in this country for rare earths, for lithium, for cobalt, and the things that this committee is talking about and considering. So there's, I would say, unparalleled exploration upside and vast exploration potential here in Canada that we need to maximize to ensure that all of those downstream issues that we may be considering are put in focus as opposed to the upstream portions that are maybe lacking right now.
Okay. So on that, so between the different levels of government and the private sector, what is it that needs to be implemented or changed to ensure that we are expanding and maintaining that supply chain?
It's a great question. And I think, again, I'll come back to our recommendations, and for good reason. I think knowledge is key. And I believe what we've seen in recent mandate letters around a reliance on evidence, science and evidence-based decision-making is the right one to do. With that in mind, I think there is information we still need to have in hand to be able to make quality decisions that are thinking 10 and 20 years down the road, has been indicated by some of the other panelists here today. And so public geoscience is very important in terms of its value to the Canadian public. We also see the government starting to take steps like forming a pan-Canadian geoscience strategy. These are the types of interactions between the federal and provincial governments, all the way down to municipal governments, that needs to be taken into consideration. So when we think about access to land, when we think about energy demands, again, when we think about the impacts on potential local communities, these are thought well in advance, so that we're not having to make decisions in short term and put us behind our competitors with respect to participating in these opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Killing.
Thank you.
J'ai une question pour Dr. Karim Zaghbi.
I have a question for Dr. Karim Zaghbi. Given your 36 years of experience, when it comes to research and development in the transition to applications and the rechargeable batteries need for EVs, is there anything that can be done? Is this something that can be done everywhere in Canada? Are there regional challenges? Are there infrastructure challenges or even weather challenges which would cause electric vehicles to not be used everywhere?
Okay, very quick. Canada a la technologie.
Canada has the technology to develop the mine and do the first processing up until the active materials to the cell to the module. And this was developed as of the 70s. Hydro-Quebec, Molly Energy, Jeff Dan. An example today. If you see the Tesla, the NM6 was developed by Jeff Dan, and the LP was developed by Hydro-Quebec and its partners. So the technology was born in Canada, and we have the human capital. We've got everything. There's no problem about a car not being able to work in low temperatures. We are capable of finding solutions thanks to the human capital, thanks to the very good Canadian universities we have, and thanks to our institutions and the ecosystem we have here in Canada. Thank you. Thank you, Madame Lapointe and Professor Zaghbi. And now I turn the floor over to Mr. Lemieux. 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair.
Do you believe that the current standard that is set for conducting security reviews is sufficient?
No, I don't. I think that particularly with China, with its highly coordinated process, they can be inclined to do investments in just under the threshold areas multiply to try and achieve their, it's like playing a game of Go, they eventually surround you and then you're stuck. So no, I don't. I think that we ought to really be looking at this in a way which is much more responsive to the reality on the ground. My concern is that, there are elements within Canada who represent interests of the People's Republic of China, consciously or unconsciously, who will probably, dampen down the enthusiasm of government for responding to this committee's report.
One last question to Mr. Fortier. How far are we away from having a full EV ecosystem in Canada?
Well, thanks for that question. So full ecosystem, we talked about the timeframes for mining, right? So that's a big part of it. But the great news is that we actually have a lot of that ecosystem. We have manufacturers. We mentioned Lion Electric. We've got, electric heavy duty manufacturers and mining manufacturers. We've got obviously an auto sector that's mature here. So the full ecosystem, it's going to take some time for sure. And that is on the upstream side, really. It's the mining and refining and processing. The great news is we've heard a lot about this. We have the capacity to do this, but it is going to take some time. That doesn't mean that it's not worth doing, right? I mean, the great news is that people are going to be driving electric vehicles for many, many years. We don't need to be doing this next year, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be starting to ramp up capacity for, towards the end of the decade.
Thank you, Mr. Fortier. Thank you, Mr. Fast. We'll move now to Mr. Erskine-Smith for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I want to ask Mr. Zaghib and Mr. Killeen around timelines for these development projects. Mr. Zaghib, you just indicated we need to speed up the timelines. With greater specificity, what does that look like?
Yeah, I believe for me, let's see if we can make the mine less than 4 years, makes sense. And the transformations is about 2 years for existing materials. Because mine, let's say, can give you one example, okay? Let's mining the graphite. If we can mining the graphite, it takes, if we're making less than 4 years, we're going to have raw material of graphite, and it takes like 1 year and a half, 2 years to bring graphite to the market, transformation, purification, and so on. This number. And then if we are going to develop new materials, this is what the technology is here. Usually it takes 10 years. And then if the program with EI and supporting that, we can short it for 5 years. So 4 years, 1 year and a half, 2 years, and then for new materials, less than 5 years.
That's very helpful insofar as the government could well set targets for approvals and moving things forward more quickly. To that point, Mr. Killeen, are there specific recommendations we would make other than timelines, but specific recommendations around regulation that could move things more quickly?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And if I could, I'll step back and just talk about the timelines for a moment as well. When you think about, especially from bringing in something from exploration to an extractive mine, exploration is certainly onerous. As I talked about earlier, the odds of success are pretty low. It's very capital intensive. Most of the exploration companies that exist today are pre-revenue. They don't have earnings from an operating mine somewhere, so they're reliant on going to capital markets, raising new equity, and putting that equity in the ground in hopes of finding something. The exploration process itself can be very onerous. It could take 5 to 10 years to actually define a economically viable deposit through typical exploration processes. That's just the time and effort that it takes to get through that. So when we think about today, if we were going to start to activate our industry and take them to a particular place in the country and start doing those exploration activities to bring the production, we might be looking